everyone. The Hayek Prize is a celebration of Friedrich Hayek, one of the most consequential thinkers of the modern era, a celebrated economist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1974. Hayek did more than just make intellectual breakthroughs. He inspired a generation of economic reformers who helped liberate countless millions from poverty around the world, and his message remains vitally important as we look to the future. Above all else, Hayek was a partisan of individual liberty, who saw economic freedom as inextricably linked to human progress, and who understood the dangers of an unlimited state that would rob ordinary people of their agency, dignity, and creative potential. I'm proud to say that Hayek played a role in the formation of the Manhattan Institute as well. One of our founders, Sir Anthony Fisher, a successful entrepreneur, once asked him how to reverse the erosion of freedom. Hayek urged him to invest in the battlefield of ideas, and that is exactly what we at the Manhattan Institute do today. We at the Manhattan Institute are dedicated to building on Hayek's legacy, and this prize is the crown jewel of these efforts. Each year, we award $50,000 to the book that best encapsulates and advances Hayek's conceptions of economic and political liberty. The Hayek Prize is one of the most generous book prizes in the world. Tonight, we will hear from the 2025 Hayek Prize winner, Johan Norberg, author of the Capitalist Manifesto, Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World. A prolific author and senior fellow at the Cato Institute, Norberg is an unabashed partisan of free trade, open immigration, and cosmopolitan values. At a time when thinkers on the left and right insist that globalization is best understood as a failed experiment, Norberg's book offers a bracing defense of economic freedom. And whether you agree with him in every detail or not, you'll come away from the Capitalist Manifesto challenged, enriched, and enlightened. Before I turn the podium over to my distinguished colleague John Tierney, there are several people I would like to thank for their support and hard work that goes into this prize. None of this work would be possible without the support and friendship of Manhattan Institute trustee Thomas W. Smith, who first conceived the prize, and Diane Smith. Together, they have supported the prize since its inception. Please join me in thanking them for their generosity and commitment to the cause of freedom. In addition to Mr. Smith, we have a number of other Manhattan Institute trustees who have kindly joined us tonight. Nick O'Neill, Michael Kaufman, Russell Penoyer, and our President Emeritus, Larry Mohn. Please join me in thanking them as well. I'd also like to recognize the Hayek Prize jury, the distinguished women and men who carefully read each nominated book before selecting the winner. Brian Anderson, Donald J. Boudreau, Tom Easton, Catherine Mangue-Ward, James Pearson, Judge Glock, John Tierney, the chairman of the Hayek Prize jury, and Amity Schlaze, of course. John is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at City Journal, and one of the nation's most renowned science journalists. A best-selling author known for his keen ability to make complex ideas engaging and accessible, he is a Hayekian through and through, and a perfect steward for this important prize and its important mission. Please join me in welcoming John Tierney to the stage.
Thank you, Raihan, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And once again, thank you, Thomas and Diane, for bringing us together to hear some Hayekian wisdom that unfortunately is more timely than ever this year. You know, back in the 1990s, a half century after Hayek published The Road to Serfdom, there was a new edition of it published with an introduction by the great economist Milton Friedman. Now, back then, as you might remember, Bill Clinton and other Democrats were declaring the end of the era of big government. But Friedman knew better. He knew that Hayek's wisdom was going to be essential in the future because, as he wrote in that introduction, the battle for freedom must be won over and over. Oh boy, have we learned that lesson recently. We endured unprecedented restrictions of individual freedom during the pandemic and watched the Biden administration borrow trillions of dollars to finance its master plan for remaking and managing the national economy. Then Americans voted for a change. We'd had enough of that. And now we have an administration that wants to remake and manage the whole world's economy. The new master planners in Washington figured they could just very quickly redesign the entire global trading system without doing any damage to American investors, American businesses, and of course without causing any prices at Walmart to go up. If only they'd listened to Hayek. As he wrote, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." Well, this curious task has been performed brilliantly by Johan Norberg in the Capitalist Manifesto. It demonstrates old truths with new data and surprising trends and everyday stories from around the world. It's a lot more entertaining than the Communist Manifesto. And also, I have to say, it's much easier read than Hayek's books. I'm a fan of Hayek, but Johan writes better. Norberg is a gifted writer who keeps you turning the page as he breezily demolishes the current myths about the supposed failures of global capitalism. In the tradition of last year's winner, the myth of American inequality, which debunked the claims that low-income and middle-income Americans have been suffering and getting poor as a result of capitalism. I'm glad to say we have one of the authors here, Senator Phil Gramm. Do you want to stand up? Thank you. Now, this year's winner adds to the evidence about income inequality in America, and it also shows how capitalism is helping to raise incomes of the poor around the world. This year, we had an exceptionally strong group of finalists for the prize. You can read about their books in the program, but I want to single out one of them who's with us this evening, Philip Howard, the author of Everyday Freedom, Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society. Howard is a marvelously lucid writer and a savvy lawyer who's been renowned for his books proposing common sense reforms to government regulation. His latest book gives the DOGE team in Washington a practical guide to making government more effective, which is simplify the rules, give bureaucrats more discretion to use their own judgment, but also make them accountable for the results. I highly recommend it. Philip, could you stand? Thank you. Our speaker this evening has been defending free markets and free trade for decades as an author and as the host and producer of television documentaries in the United States and other countries. He's born in Sweden. He's written more than 20 books that have been translated into more than 24 languages. And he's got a new one coming out this fall, Peak Human, which analyzes the rise and fall of past civilizations. This evening, he will be focusing on our current civilization and the lessons of the Capitalist Manifesto, which is a book, fortunately, that has been read by at least one advisor to the current administration, Elon Musk. He was quite impressed. This book, Musk said, is an excellent explanation of why capitalism is not just successful, but morally right. Now we'll hear that explanation, a new salvo in the endless battle for freedom, directly from the author. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the winner of the 2025 Hayek Book Prize, Johan Norberg.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow nominee, that was a great book. I had to read all the books that were nominated because you seem to have such good judgment in the selection committee. So, honored recipients from previous years, thank you. This is an immense honor to me. So I'm deeply grateful to the Manhattan Institute, to Thomas Smith for conceiving and funding this prize originally, and specifically, of course, to the selection committee. It is a tremendous honor. It is a great thing, not just to me, it's actually a great thing for my whole family. Because you know what? You know what's the hardest thing of being a writer? Is to try to convince your wife and your kids that staying at home in the morning, lying in the sofa reading books is real work. So if this doesn't convince them, this kind of recognition, I don't think anything can. And looking at the list of previous winners is a very humbling experience. It's a lineup of great thinkers who have inspired me in so many different ways. Thomas Sowell, William Easterly, Deirdre McCloskey, Amity Shlaes, Phil Graham, Matt Ridley, Douglas Irwin, John Tomasi, James Grant. It sounds like I'm reading the spines in my own bookshelves back home, which is a great sign. And then to be introduced by John Tierney, and noticing that people like Don Boudreau, Mary O'Grady are here in the audience, it makes me feel like I'm in a zombie movie in reverse. It feels like I'm surrounded on all sides by assailants who don't want to eat my brain, but rather sort of try to enhance my brain in different ways. So for that, I'm grateful. Thank you for your hard work. I appreciate it. And speaking of big brains, let's talk about Friedrich August Hayek. I'm especially grateful to receive this award in his name, since his work has been so influential on my thoughts, on my work, and on this book in particular. You might have seen, if you've read the book, on the first page, you notice my dedication to the classical liberals of all parties. And that is obviously an overt reference to Hayek and to the socialists of all parties in the road to serfdom. He tried to convince people that they had bought in to the wrong kind of ideas, that they had bought too much from the wrong side. And that's a worthy ambition. My ambition, however, is slightly different. I'm trying to make people in all parties see how much they implicitly, subconsciously understand the value of liberty and of markets. Because most people understand, because that's how they behave in their private lives. They're trying to assume responsibility, they're trying to work hard, they specialize, they follow the price signals, and they try constantly to rely on markets for essentials. They see things working in practice. And then they ask themselves, does this work in theory? And unfortunately, often their answer is in the negative. And I think that's because they talk themselves into the wrong conclusions. They talk themselves into mistakes because of two mental biases. But unfortunately, to some extent, we all share those biases. Two fundamental challenges to liberty that Hayek identified and worked hard to try to come to grips with. It's the zero-sum myth that the world and the economy is a zero-sum game, and it's the pretense of knowledge. To begin with the first, Hayek wrote, "It is one of the great tragedies of our time that the masses have come to believe that they can only reach a high standard of material welfare by pulling down the wealthy." If someone is better off, be it big business, be it the 1%, be it trading partners or immigrants or users of new technologies, it must mean that they have somehow taken it away from us. It must be that if someone gets rich, it is at the expense of somebody else. And therefore, you need redistribution, you need protection, you need regulation to stop them from taking advantage of you. And I think this is because of our legacy, of our prehistory. As Homo sapiens, we've lived for a long time, say 300,000 years. For around 99.9% of that time, we've lived in a zero-sum game. Not always, not all the time, but we didn't have rapid economic growth or innovation. It is the case that archaeologists, when they talk about a new axe or a new technology, it's 5,000 years old in prehistory. And therefore, if someone was richer and more successful than you, they probably took it from you. So it made sense to be suspicious, deeply suspicious of those who were successful. However, Hayek showed this to be nonsense in the extended order, where people live together in peace, voluntarily interacting to their mutual advantage, and where no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they will gain from it. He elaborated on this in many of his books. But of course, we can just look out the window and see the evidence that this zero-sum game is a myth. Look at Manhattan. This used to be nothing but meadows, dense forests, and swampy wetlands, pretty worthless. For my next book, Peak Human, that John mentioned, on golden ages in history, I've done a lot of research on the Dutch Republic in the 16th and 17th century. And it's always surprising and a little bit weird that they gave Manhattan away, right? It's that they surrendered it at the peace agreement in 1667 to the English for Suriname, because Suriname had nutmeg, right? Now it seems weird. And it wasn't just Manhattan. Actually, they gave away New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware for some nutmeg. And most people thought that they got the better deal. And actually they did. In 1667, nutmeg was the most important resource, because everything that makes Manhattan valuable came because of new ideas, hard work, human ingenuity and effort. Free people, creative people. New York would not be the same without New Yorkers. Manhattan would not be the same without the Manhattan Institute, obviously. And since 1667, global extreme poverty has declined from roughly 9 out of 10 people around the world to less than 1 out of 10 people around the world, giving the lie to it a some myth. It is instead, as Hayek put it, a wealth-creating game. Yes, for once, Hayek actually came up with a more popular term than a technical one. Rather than talking about a positive-sum game, he talked about a wealth-creating game. And that's a lesson that we constantly have to reinforce. The other problem is the pretense of knowledge, the fatal conceit that we can fully master, design, and plan human societies and the human economy. In the past 5 years, we have experienced some attempts to do that on a large scale. Some major policy blunders, I would say. Unprecedented policy experiments. We had the COVID lockdowns, we had Biden's spending spree, and we had Trump's Liberation Day. When we faced a new COVID virus, the governments, almost all governments around the world, thought it better to allow a small set of experts to decide the incredibly difficult trade-offs on how to protect ourselves and our families compared to everything that we sacrifice in terms of liberty, in terms of wealth, in terms of human interaction, in terms of spending time with our loved ones, and not allowing the real experts, the millions and millions of people who have to face the consequences of making those decisions every day. Almost all governments, except, with some pride, Sweden's government actually made another decision over there. But then, just as we thought we got out of this thing, they pulled us right back in when the Biden administration thought that the way to deal with this was massive stimulus packages and trying to come up with huge attempts of active industrial policy, trying to decide which companies and which sectors should be promoted and supported on the expense of everybody else. And then they pulled us right back in when Trump thought that he could do the same thing with a global economy and actually decide trading patterns and trade balances between every country on the planet, decide which countries should get the protection and be punished by tariffs, and which ones deserve a generous exception. Now we even have a president who knows the exact number of dolls and pencils our sons and daughters need, which is quite impressive. I don't think even the Soviet Politburo knew that. These policy blunders, I think, are all different variants of the knowledge problem. As Hayek taught us, knowledge is out there. It doesn't exist in the mind of any single individual, no single committee, no political committee, not even a single business committee. It exists out there, on factory floors, in offices, in households, out there on the fields. And therefore, governments shouldn't plan the economy, because that makes it impossible for people to plan their economies. It's one plan that destroys millions of plans. As he pointed out, we should not empower some good people that we think are good people, but instead search for good principles. We should not look for fixes, but for fixed rules that restrain the arbitrary power of governments. We need limited government and economic freedom to make use of all knowledge in society and open up for surprises, for innovation, and for progress. Hayek needed many books to explain the knowledge problem. But I think we can also summarize it in the old joke about the job interview. You know, this guy walking up to the office and they are sitting there interviewing him, looking at his CV, and oh, it says here, you're quick at maths. You do calculations real quickly, yeah? Yes, okay. So what is 16 times 17? Oh, it's 42. What? That's not even close. No, but it was quick. And that's the problem. Every time a government, a fixer, someone in power tells us they can fix all our problems, it is quick maths. Because the only thing we do is that we replace the wisdom of millions of people constantly experimenting through trial and error, feedback from the market, constant adaptation, pushback, feedback, and then new experiments. We replace all of that with just the preferences of a few people at the top. And that's why it always fails. That's why these ideas of government intervention, it's not something new and exciting. We've done it before, again and again, and it has a very long and disappointing track record. So that's what we get, quick maths over the past few years. More money chasing fewer goods, and we got the return of inflation. Industrial policy leading to costly misallocation of capital because governments are bad at picking winners, but losers are good at picking governments and of picking the pockets of the taxpayers and the consumers all the time because they know how to do this. And then tariffs ruin specializations, and for every job saved, we might lose some 10 jobs in other sectors because we lose productivity, we lose purchasing power, and intermediary goods become more public debts. This all results in the fracturing of our economy and surging public debts that look increasingly unsustainable. So we're in a difficult moment right now. Hell, it is sometimes said, is truth seen too late. Our task here is to remind people of Hayekian truths before we go to hell. Our task is to warn people about where these policies lead, this temptation of allowing some fixer to solve all our problems, that it always ends up disappointing us. And to moderate their impact and to promote other ideals and design other policy plans so that they are ready and waiting when people realize how disappointing this is. This is hard work, and it is complex work, somewhat more difficult than just promising, guaranteeing perfect outcomes instantly. This is more tricky because we have to remind people of economic principles. We have to talk about the world, we have to talk about data, we have to talk about history, about economics. It is complex work since it is clashing with beliefs rooted in human nature. Hayek pointed out that socialism, collectivism, nationalism are inheritances of tribal society. The idea that we need a common purpose and that we all have to subject ourselves to one big plan rather than pursuing our happiness in our own individual ways. Therefore, interventionist ideas will always return. They will always hold a certain appeal because it speaks to our tribal old mindsets. And that means our battle is never won once and for all. It always will keep on returning those challenges, and therefore we always have to keep on fighting. And that is why Margaret Thatcher pointed out that we have to wake up earlier in the morning than our opponents, because they wake up early trying to undermine our freedoms. We have to wake up even earlier because our job is more complex. Sometimes we even have to defy jet lag to fight against these ideas. It's hard work, but the good news is that we, unlike them, have reality on our side. And we will have reality on our side, at least as long as we keep Hayek's ideas alive. Constantly engage with those ideas and apply them in new ways to the challenges of our time. I was reminded of this recently when I read the best book review I've ever read on Amazon Books. It was a review of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, a book that was published in 1859, so a bit late to come with some constructive feedback, but I admire the ambition. This guy didn't want to give this book more than 3 stars. Why? Well, he said, because while John Stuart Mill's arguments are sound, his examples are a little bit dated. And don't you love that? Isn't that great? Because, you know, he's right. Sort of all the barns and the bridges and the stuff like that, it's a little bit dated. And that goes for Hayek as well. And for Adam Smith and for Hume and Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman, their ideas are sound, but the examples are a little bit dated. So we constantly have to update them and apply them to the current controversies, to current problems that we are facing, to the new enemies that we are facing, or, as it says in the program here tonight, a quote from Hayek, if old truths are to retain their hold on men's minds, they must be restated in the language and concepts of successive generations. And I think that's true. If freedom is to have any chance of lasting, despite all these tribal temptations, this is what we should do, and that is what I tried to do when I wrote this book. So, to conclude, to receive this prize in Hayek's name feels profoundly meaningful. I mean, he just won the Nobel Prize in Stockholm. I won the Hayek Prize in Manhattan. And you know what's the best thing about it? I don't have to share it with Gunnar Myrdal. and for that, and for this recognition, I say I'm so grateful. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks for that great lecture. Maybe that guy should give 4 stars, for the review on Amazon. Let's start just, you mentioned it, and you talked tariffs, but you want to just, and you deal with that in the book, of course, and that's the topic of the hour. What do you have to say about tariffs, and what does, some of us you have an idea, but tell us.
Trade is this amazing machine. If it had been invented, it would have been seen as the greatest machine that had ever been created, because it's a machine into which you can put anything you've got a surplus of, anything you're able to produce. And on the other side of the machine, you'll get anything you want. So you can basically go out into the fields and plant cars. you can program a hamburger and a nice Cabernet Sauvignon on your computer. That's what trade is all about. It's making your own work more valuable by being able to exchange it with the best of others. It's a way of getting access to the brains and the talent and the hard work of everybody else. So it's the best machine that's ever been invented, and denying yourself access to that machine is to make yourself poorer. It's a way of restricting yourself to something worse. I can see the temptation. There's always the tribal temptation, let's make everything back home. But it's really a way of making yourself poorer, less exposed to the best ideas out in the world. So it's a terrible, terrible shame. I think that the good thing is that there's instant feedback. You notice that you're getting poorer when you do it. And if there's some silver lining in the present moment of these trade wars, is that suddenly everybody realizes that this is not just a theoretical thing. Trade is something, when we lose access to it, it's bad. It's like air.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's something to that.
Well, now the argument for the protectionists is that the global trade has hurt blue-collar workers, that it's deindustrialized America, and you discuss that really well in the book. Why don't you tell us what's wrong with the whole deindustrialization argument?
It's not deindustrialization. American manufacturing production is probably at what do you say, Don? Isn't it at an all-time high right now? Yeah. But we need fewer people to do it. And that's a good thing, because we've been able to become more productive. We need fewer hands in those factories. And that's how we improve every area of production. That's what we did to agriculture once upon a time. We used to be 8 out of 10 in here used to be in agriculture, and we couldn't even feed ourselves in most countries on the planet. But then we got equipment, we got machines, we got better management, and suddenly we were able to be more productive. We need fewer people. That happens in every country that's getting richer. It even in the export powerhouses with trade surpluses. You know, Germany began to lose people in manufacturing in the 1970s. Japan did in the 1980s. South Korea did in the 1990s. It happens in every place except the only region where we see more people entering the manufacturing sector, relatively speaking, is sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not the economy that we should be trying to imitate. Instead, we should constantly try to become more productive, more competitive, and move on to better goods and services that are more valuable, and that will make us richer in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And now, as you say, even China has been losing manufacturing.
That's right. If the very place that's stealing all our manufacturing jobs are also losing manufacturing jobs, some 1 million manufacturing jobs a year, that tells you something, right? The one way that China is trying to stay competitive in manufacturing is by automating more robots. That's how they do it. And that tells you that this is not the way that we will become more wealthier tomorrow, by returning to some past with more people, relatively speaking, in those jobs.
Now, the other complaint is that, well, you know, maybe it helps the whole economy trade, but we've lost these good jobs. There was a golden age of manufacturing. Those jobs were so good, and now we have crummy jobs and don't have what happened to those wonderful jobs at the Detroit auto plants. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah. Well, there are so many things to unpack there. First one is that when did we begin to lose jobs there in the manufacturing sector? In the 1950s. That's when it started to become more productive, in the 1960s and onwards. And then it's actually slowed down a little bit since China joined the World Trade Organization. It's declined, but at a slower pace than before. Why was that? Partly because it became more productive, partly because the business climate wasn't great. Most of those jobs were early on lost to southern states that had right-to-work laws and didn't have trade unions that increased the wages faster than they increased productivity and so on. So that's the first thing to remember. The other thing is, I think nostalgia is a dangerous drug, and I use it all the time, nostalgia. We all know that the best music was produced in the year we were 14 years old, and that goes, you know, when you ask people when were families the most harmonious, the economy the best, sports were the greatest, we all say between 5 and 20 years old. That's no matter which generation you belong to. And that's fine. I love nostalgia, but the best cure is just looking at old photos, speaking to old friends with over a glass of wine. That's fine. It's not a governing philosophy. And you can't return to a place like that because it never really existed except in your own mind. So if you're thinking about Detroit in the 1950s and that's what you want to return to, speak to the historians instead or people who were there. And then you realize that those jobs were hard. They didn't pay well. Well, they did compared to what their parents had, but that's because they were in the Second World War and in the Great Depression. So obviously it was fantastic and compared to subsistence agriculture. But not if you compared it to what came later. When you talk to people, oral history, it was difficult, it was precarious jobs, and actually even those who had the kind of sort of trade union protected jobs for a brief moment in time when East Asia basically didn't exist. Europe had been destroyed, so all the jobs were basically in Michigan. Well, if you had one of those jobs, what did you make? What was the average wage? And if you adjust it for inflation, well, then you end up with the same kind of entry-level wage you get in an Amazon warehouse today. And why did people take those jobs? Well, almost without exception, when you talk to those who got them, dangerous jobs, you might lose a limb or two. They said, I do this to make sure that my children won't have to have a job like this. To get an education, get a service job, a white-collar job, rather than doing this. So beware of nostalgia when it comes to the sort of the political temptation of nostalgia and read the history.
Right. As you note, even J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy makes a point that none of his classmates growing up in Ohio wanted to go into the steel mills there. They wanted something else. But now, for some reason, he wants us all to go back to the mills. I don't know. You mentioned Sweden's experience in the pandemic. And also, of course, Bernie Sanders loves to talk about Sweden as a great model of socialism. And I wonder, what is it about Sweden that as far as the socialist myth, and also, any idea why Sweden did so well in the pandemic?
Well, for some reason, people keep returning to Sweden as an example. And I think that's because we're non-intimidating and kind of almost exaggerated agreeableness. And, if you're a socialist and you've seen your previous examples fail again and again, sort of, we should do like the Soviet Union, that would be great. And oh, no, I meant China. And oh, not China. Well, until they turned around and liberalized. Then they went to Cuba and said, oh, no, that's not real socialism, so let's go for Venezuela instead. $1,000 billion basically in oil revenue and losing some 75% of GDP, and everybody fled for their lives. That's why they keep returning to Sweden, because that never happened in Sweden. We didn't get the bread lines, we didn't get the dictatorship, we didn't get that misery. But why was that? Because we're not socialists in Sweden. That's the problem with their case. And I always tell American socialists that if you want to be like Sweden, you do have to actually in many ways have more free markets than the US. More free trade, no occupational licensing, a national school voucher system. You have to reform Social Security and include private accounts. You have to abolish taxes on property, on wealth, on gifts, and on inheritance, and actually have a less progressive tax system overall. Reduce corporate taxes compared to where America is today. Instead, you have to increase taxes on low and middle income households. That's the dirty little secret of the Swedish experiment. We make low and middle income households pay for it all. Why is that? Because and a very high VAT, value added consumption tax at 25%. Why is that? Because we tried the other thing in the 1970s. We tried to go big on socialism, doubling the size of government, increasing taxes on everything. That wasn't our golden era. That was our Atlas Shrugged moment. That's when IKEA left Sweden. That's when Tetra Pak and H&M left Sweden. All the great entrepreneurs left because you couldn't do business, and we didn't get any other businesses that were really important. So for 30 years, we didn't create a single net job in the private sector in Sweden. And at that time, and especially at the moment in time in the early 1990s when a debt and inflation-fueled boom ended up in a financial crisis, one observer pointed out that this is not just unsustainable, this is absurd and it's perverse. We have to go in the other direction. That observer was the Social Democratic Minister of Finance in Sweden. And after that, we began to reform, and afterwards, Sweden began to make some real progress again. So, you know, the Bernie Sanders of the world, they remember this brief moment in time in the 1970s when Sweden was still rich, still one of the richest countries on the planet, and very socialist. But it's like that old joke, you know, how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a big one, and then you start wasting most of it. So let's not go there. We learned our lesson, and we're trying to explain that lesson to others before you make the same mistake.
Well, you've explained it very well. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience here?
Hello. Congratulations on winning the award, and thank you for your lecture. I think you're assuming that we live in a perfect world, a messianic world. In that world, yes, I can understand how capitalism, why the global free market will save the world. The problem is we don't live in such a world. There are malevolent actors. There are malevolent actors who have a monopoly on rare minerals. We've seen, I mean, would it have made sense to sell steel to Japan knowing that they were going to declare war against us? How do you deal with reality?
Yeah. Now, that's a great question, because we always want reality as one of the variables when we're talking about. Let me first just point out, when I say that the global free market will save the world, I'm not saying that we'll have eternal salvation on this planet, and as I pointed out in my lecture, I think that this battle will always rage constantly, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and you are doing what you are doing. But you know, in the past 25 years, despite all the horrors that we've seen in the world, from terrorism to war, a pandemic that shut down the world, financial crisis, it's still been the best 25 years in human history. If you look at objective indicators, a third of all the wealth that has ever been created, if we measure it by GDP per capita, was created during these 25 years. 130,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty every day for 25 years. And it happened in the places that began to open up their markets, empower their own populations, and being able to trade more freely and to contribute to the economy. And that's what I mean by saving the world. One life at a time, one person at a time. You know, child mortality in the past 25 years was roughly halved, which means that last year 4 million fewer children died than in the year 2000. That's pretty amazing. And it happened in the places that began to open up to freer markets. Now, that doesn't mean that the world is perfect, and we do have some bad actors out there. And obviously, when it comes to things like important essential resources like rare earth minerals, we shouldn't be dependent on that by an actor that might not have our best interest at heart. To me, that's an argument to look at our supply chains, see whether there are risks out there. I don't think the solution is to concentrate supply chains and make everything at home. On the contrary, there's a reason why the old saying doesn't go put all your eggs in one basket and protect it with tariffs and regulations, but instead to diversify, to open up to trade with more actors around the world so that we can constantly adapt and find new sources for what we're having. But also to deregulate back home. You've got a lot of rare earth minerals right here. And actually in Sweden, in northern Sweden, we recently found the biggest rare earth mineral supplies in Europe. It's just that the miners over there say that it'll take them 15 years just to get an approval to start digging for it, even though they had been digging in the very same place for 150 years to get iron ore out of the ground. So to me, it tells us, liberate ourselves and make sure that we can use the supplies and the resources that we have, and then make sure that bad actors are more dependent on us than we are on them, so that will be a restraining influence on their decisions in the future.
Yeah, I'll stand up. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of data on young people's recent infatuation, more than ever, with socialism, including at elite campuses where they should know better. So there are really two questions here. One is, how do you explain the sudden surge among young people in embracing people like Bernie Sanders? And second of all, is it really a problem in the sense that adolescents go through stages? We all know that. Is their current infatuation more like acne? They'll outgrow this thing when they get to a certain age and the proper hormones kick in and they have to get a job and work in the economy. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on the current infatuation with socialism among young people.
That's a great metaphor. I'll be using that in the future. I think the temptation is always there, partly because this sort of Hayek talked about as the inheritance of a more tribal world will always keep on returning in new generations unless you've seen the results of some of those bad policies. And obviously, if you're recently born into this world, you have to study economics or history closely to realize those problems. Otherwise, those promises by some big guy just telling you, I'll solve all your problems. Now, if you add to that the temptation of having just free stuff, I think that temptation will always be there as well. And if you think of it, our kids, I mean, we love them, right? But they're a little bit stupid as well, because they haven't faced the real feedbacks of a real world where you have to take responsibility for your decisions and you have to sustain yourself. You've been born into this world and you've been given all the necessary supplies, and then you enter a school world where an educational world where you don't really have those market incentives. It takes some time. Something happens when you enter the labor market and when you move out, right? I can see that myself. Suddenly something, oh, right, now I get it. And now I understand why you complain about taxes and things like that. So yes, in a way it's like acne, but there are also cycles as well. There are business cycles. There are business cycles on our attitude to businesses as well. And I think especially in a world that seems troubling and dangerous and scary, there will always be this temptation to search for some strong man or a big government that'll protect you and take care of you. And that's the most dangerous temptation there is. I understand why it's there, and that's why we have to talk to them about why it's the job interview. It's quick maths. Don't fall for it. It's a bad thing. We want correct maths, even though it might take a bit longer.
It seems like every day there's a tech CEO who's making some bold prediction about how AI is going to take a bunch of jobs and is going to replace a lot of the work that we do. But you talked about how capital in the past has been a benefit to us. Is this time different? Is it now something where it's going to take basic functions that are necessary for jobs to begin with?
Well, that's a great question. I'm thinking about that quite a lot, and I'm asking ChatGPT about this quite a lot recently. And what the two of us have concluded so far is that it's probably not different. I would have been shocked 25 years ago when I started writing books on the free market. I would have been shocked to see what my work process is like. Because once upon a time, the reason why I had a comparative advantage, or even a sort of an absolute advantage over some others in writing books and studies, was that I understood how libraries worked. I understood how to get the data, the right books, the statistic series and stuff like that. That took some 50% of my work time, just to be in Stockholm Library all the time. And that I identified myself as, I'm this great library guy. Actually, half of all my work has been automated since then by the World Wide Web, by Google, by search engines. Suddenly all that data is available right now to everyone. And I would have assumed then probably that half of all writers will be gone. no, half of our time is now spent on other things than we did back then. And hopefully the more creative part, I hope, using that data, analyzing and trying to come up with better conclusions, more easily accessible, taking more of our time, thinking of new examples, better metaphors, and so on. And I think that's what we're doing constantly. We're always automating, we're always becoming more productive, which means that we can then spend more of our time on the things where we can add extra value. Other areas, other sectors where people will lose their jobs, for sure. Definitely, there will be sort of routine mental operations that will be done better by AI in the future. I would have assumed that there would be problems for translators as well, but I just realized that I think we have 6% more people working in translations in the US today than last year. So it seems like this is an ongoing process where we're constantly trying to move to the areas where we can add more. How do we do that? We do that by being adaptable, by being able to improvise, by constantly experimenting with where we can add more value. And that's another reason why heavy regulation and controls telling us what to do is disastrous, because that keeps us in those areas that might be gone quite soon. So it'll change, it'll always change, just like it always has. But it'll also, as long as we are humans with ambitions, ideas, desires, and demand that seem so far, at least, to be unlimited, we won't have ever reach a period when we will think that we have too much people to satisfy those demands.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your incisive and impassioned lecture earlier. Out of the various thinkers you mentioned alongside Hayek, one you did not mention is Schumpeter, who had made or had raised the question of whether economic freedom is compatible with political freedom, or certainly historically may not have been. What is your view?
I'm not sure, but I think it's the greatest chance for both economic freedom and for political freedom in the long run that we combine them. It is still the case, I think, the conclusions of both Hayek and Friedman, that we need a kind of economic decentralization. We need this kind of different centers of power and of resources and of capital to give political freedom a chance. If it's all centralized, then it's probably over with, because we will all be yes men in that hierarchy with that particular person. And if we look at it from the other side. So, I mean, we've had examples of authoritarian governments that have upheld economic freedom, but we've never had examples of democracies that have lasted in the long run unless they've been had a platform of economic freedom. And if we look at it from the other side then, from centralized governments, authoritarian governments, dictatorships, we can always mention those examples. There are some that upheld economic freedom, even personal freedoms in some instances. But those are rare exceptions. It's less likely you'll find a Lee Kuan Yew than a Mao Zedong or a Hugo Chavez, if you go that route. Because even if democratic governments and free speech, they are imperfect feedback systems, they're better than no feedback systems when it comes to politics. Will it be possible in the long run to sustain those institutions? You know, it's tricky. It's always been difficult to uphold freedom. That's why we fight, because it is slightly counterintuitive. We want the protection. We have this tribal mindset. We have this evolutionary heritage of looking for someone to guide us and protect us constantly. It takes longer, complex mental operations to reach the conclusions that emergent orders, spontaneous orders, are actually better ways of organizing human interactions. And and this is actually something that I write a lot about in the next book, Peak Human, what we can learn from the rise and fall of golden ages. Sometimes it happens by accident. For some reason, you end up with those institutions. If you have 1,000 Greek city-states, at least one of them will come up with slightly more libertarian institutions, 400 BC. And in that case, they might, in a very Hayekian way, last longer and sustain themselves better than others. But those are rare exceptions. And that's why we should never, ever, ever take this for granted. If you, like me, think that this is actually a golden age, the best golden age ever, because this time it's fairly global. For the first time, the average human being leads the kind of lives that emperors and kings would have envied. Not just 200 years ago, 100 years ago. In that case, don't take it for granted because it is an exception historically. Then we have to understand the institutions that made it possible and fight for it. Whether we will succeed or not in the long run, we'll see. We don't know. But I do know that if we despair and become pessimists and give up, then we will certainly fail. So keep on going.
Okay. Well, thank you for those thoughts. Thanks for a great lecture. Thanks to all of you for coming. And I want to leave you with the concluding lines as you go forth in the battle for freedom. And I'm going to read the last lines of the Capitalist Manifesto. Liberty and progress can be your project too. We pro-capitalists of the world have nothing to lose but our chains, tariff barriers, building regulations, and confiscatory taxes. We have a world to win. Thank you and good evening.